Welcome, everybody who's attending from your various time zones around the world to this webinar on Administering Jerusalem's Holy Sites, Cooperation and Conflict. I'm Bill Barbieri from the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Value at Catholic University in DC. I'll be moderating our panel today, and I want to start off with just a few words of thanks to our partners and co-sponsors for this event. Joe Capizzi as Dean of the School of Theology and Religious Studies here at Catholic University, and David Long, who heads up the Institute for Policy Research, have both helped facilitate this event. We will be hearing from a distinguished panel today, headlined by my colleague from the law school here at Catholic University, Professor Marshall Breger, and also featuring Father David Neuhaus from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem, where he is, among other things, the Patriarchal Vicar Emeritus for Hebrew-speaking Catholics. We also have on hand today Professor Moussa Abou Ramadan from the University of Strasbourg in France. He's a professor of Muslim law and Islamology. And we're also joined by Dan Arbell, who is currently, among other places, at the American University here in Washington, D.C., and is a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service. I want to put in just a quick word for a couple of upcoming events that our center will be hosting in March. On March 20th, we will have another lecture in this series by Professor Steve Schneck, who has been recently the chairman of the International Commission on Religious Freedom. And we will have an additional session, another webinar with Andrea Sangiovanni and a number of other authors from a book on the virtue of solidarity. That will be on April 7th. So we will start today with a presentation from Professor Breger. We will then hear comments from the other panelists, a response from Professor Breger, and that will be followed by discussion among the panelists. And at that point, we will also be able to take questions from the audience. We will ask you to submit your questions through the Q&A feature on your screen. Professor Marshall Breger, our first speaker, is a professor of law at the Columbus School of Law here in Washington, D.C., where his specialties include constitutional law, arbitration, and foreign relations law. He has had many posts over the years and has served in the George H.W. Bush administration and in the Reagan administration. He's testified more than 30 times in front of the U.S. Congress. He's also been a visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and that is just one example of his long-standing involvement with Jerusalem and with Israel. He has written or edited a number of books on Jerusalem, including Jerusalem's Holy Places and the Peace Process, another book, Jerusalem, a City and Its Future. A third book is the Vatican-Israel Accord, Legal, Pontifical, and Theological Issues. And today we'll be organizing our discussion around his most recent book, The Contest and Control of Jerusalem's Holy Sites, a historical guide to legality, status, and ownership. And he published that this past year with Cambridge University Press, along with his co-author, Leonard Hammer. So Marshall, thank you very much for anchoring this discussion of the very tricky and urgent questions of managing and coping with conflicts over the holy sites in Jerusalem. Please take it away and tell us more about your work.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to discuss my co-authored book, The Contest and Control of Holy Places in Jerusalem. We should remember that questions of holy sites are not just history. The first intifada was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The Hamas massacre of October 7th was styled the Al-Aqsa Flood. And in Israel, those settlers who are messianic seek control of the Temple Mount / Haram. And when I say Temple Mount, I mean Haram and I mean Arbell. Just for the sake of economy, I'm not going to say all three. They saw it as an incentive for the coming of the Messiah. And while the happenings at the Christian churches no longer start wars, as they did in 1847, when the theft of a wall icon relic at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem gave rise to the Crimean War, they still populate the front pages of Western newspapers. In the short time I'm allotted, I intend to make 8 points. First, what is a sacred space? Sociologists and philosophers have spilled considerable ink over the question of sacrality. Put simply, what makes a place sacred? Is it the geographical space or the feelings that the population invests in that space? Sometimes popular sentiment can create a holy site, as with the case of Our Lady of Medjugorje in Bosnia, where popular belief in apparitions of the Virgin Mary at the shrine forced the Catholic Church to move away from total opposition to the sacrality of the site to granting the site a nulla osta this past September, meaning Catholics are, quote, authorized to give it their adherents in a prudent manner. And there's a dispute in Jewish law regarding the continued sanctity of the Temple Mount. The Rambam would say that the Mount retains its sanctity even after the destruction of the temple. But there's a minority view of the Ramban that when God left his house, the temple, Har HaBayit, the mountain of the house, with the destruction of the temple, it lost its sacrality. On this view, it is not the geographical place that makes it holy, but what the divine brings to the place. And indeed, attitudes toward sacred spaces can change. Sometimes sacred spaces become popular and then lose their popularity. After 1948, Mount David was for Israelis the closest site to the Western Wall, which was then in Jordanian hands. And it was built up as a holy site. After 1967, popular sentiment plunged. After all, you could go directly to the wall. The same is true with Masada, which assumed some specific religious significance between 1948 and 67 and is now reduced in popular attention. Second, a little history. The capitulations. Any discussion of the holy places in law must start with the so-called Ottoman capitulation. These were agreements that the Western powers made with the Ottomans, who were, hard to believe, the superpowers of the time. The West was the weaker side. The first capitulations began in 1536, when Francis I of France was scared of the Austrians. Emperor Charles of Austria, enemy of France, and he turned, dare I say it, to the infidel for help. And he made a treaty with the Ottomans. The treaty included military agreements. You may not know that Ottoman soldiers were decamped in Marseille for some years to protect France. Also, trade relations. But part of this was some beginning rights to religious freedom. The French secured rights to have priests and churches and protection of those churches and of the holy places. And other Western countries followed. By the way, the Dutch capitulation of the 1620s had a clause that the Ottomans can order the Catholics to allow Protestants to enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So this was kind of an interreligious effort. Now, each time a sultan died, you needed to start from zero and negotiate a new capitulation, and I suppose also provide new bribes, if I can be blunt. But the 1740 capitulation stated it was a permanent agreement, and that capitulation privileged the Greek Orthodox. The Roman Church hated this, and in fact viewed the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles as a chance to redress Greek, quote, perfidy. It didn't work. By the 19th century, geopolitics shifted, and the capitulations were used by the Ottomans, the so-called, quote, sick man of Europe, to buy off the Western powers. We also had the interesting development of the French claiming to be the protector of Catholics, and indeed all Christians in the Ottoman lands, the so-called French religious protectorate. And on the other side, the Russian Empire claiming to protect first Orthodox Christians and Christians in general, although the Ottomans never really agreed to that. They sort of had to accept it, but they never really agreed to it. Now, for our purposes, what has remained of the capitulations, which were formally abrogated after World War I, was the so-called Ottoman status quo at the holy places. And I'll turn to that for a moment. The status quo is a term given to the, quote, amorphous body of traditional norms, some unclear and others contested, encompassed in firmans or decrees, or in, since we just entered a new American administration, executive orders, which was issued by the Sultan relevant to specific Christian holy places, which included issues regarding custodianship rights, liturgical practices, damage repair, and general internal administration. As a 1919 internal White Russian memorandum noted, the status quo in the holy places was shaped by history. It was considerably affected by the degree of influence which this or that great power exercised over Turkey at one time or another. Now, the exact details of the status quo are not always clear. The Ottoman archives in Jerusalem vanished during their 1917 retreat. So in order to make some order out of possible chaos, the British assigned a military officer, Lionel Cuss, to prepare a codification of the status quo. His credentials were somewhat unique. He had read classics at Cambridge, and more important, he had played tennis with the Prince of Wales. To a great extent, an issue is part of the status quo because Cuss included it in his codification and not vice versa. Now, the status quo was reaffirmed in the Treaty of Berlin in 1870, and that is the basis for the claim that it is part of international law. When Britain took on the mandate after World War I, it reaffirmed the status quo, and for what it is worth, it was also reaffirmed in the Vatican-Israel Fundamental Accord. So what is the status quo? First, great authority of tradition. Each action, if not immediately challenged, is taken as having precedential value. So to take an extreme case, a ladder taken from the Greek, if my memory is correct, to the Roman side of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has not moved for 250 years. It became a Roman ladder. Second, repair means ownership. This follows Sharia law. And this creates a lot of problems when you need to have repair. An example, in 1920, in Bethlehem, the roof of the Church of the Nativity was falling down. The British offered to repair it. Everyone refused because they didn't want to give the British or other denominations any, quote, possible ownership rights. Now, this problem has been reduced somewhat in recent years because the churches themselves have been able to agree on repair of Christ's tomb in part by having a foundation do it, not any of the churches. And this is a huge advance in cooperation. The third is a claim of internal autonomy, control of administration, freedom from taxes, a huge issue. It's based on claims that this is of the status quo, and also some claims of the so-called French religious protectorate, and from the Waqf, Ottoman historical practice. What should be free from taxes? The Israelis have wanted to charge electricity. They wanted to charge water. They retreated. But the question of what is a religious activity is an important one, and I'll spend a moment on it later. Now, most important, what I call the rejection of Westphalia. As we know, the Treaty of Westphalia was a treaty which underscored state sovereignty. Each state has control of its borders, unlike the Holy Roman Empire, which was a kind of a skein, a mixture of all sorts of different powers and controls. One duke had to give 20 geese to the prince. Another duke had to give 10 soldiers every year to the prince. The prince had to give certain things to the emperor, but rather a state is sovereign under its own borders, and also the religion is the religion of the ruler. Now, the church and the Waqf claim some form of extraterritorial autonomy based on the status quo and historical practice. And this is in some metaphysical way rejected by Israel. Westphalia has many issues, which I won't go into here, but just to point out that since World War II, there have been many, many examples of treaties in practice where states have given up some sovereignty for benefit of even of themselves, let alone the common good. Now, fourth, I'll talk a bit about the present situation. Israel claims overall sovereignty, but allows the Waqf significant internal administrative control under the watchful eyes of the Israeli police. And we can debate what that really means in terms of their control. Now, Israel and the Waqf, of course, views themselves, as I said, as the ultimate authority on the Mount. Israel views the Haram as a holy place narrowly. The buildings, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, and perhaps the lawn at the top of the Mount. That's a question mark. The Waqf views the holy places as the entire Haram and the curtilage around the Haram, including, for example, the Western Wall. So there's an interesting debate with the Western Wall where the Ottomans said the Jews have an easement on the wall to pray and gave them metes and bounds of that easement. But the wall is larger than that easement. The Israelis claim the whole wall. The Waqf says, hey, you only have that metes and bounds that you got from the Ottoman firm in about 1910 or so. And this expansive view is specifically true of the Jordanians. The Jordanian-Israel Peace Treaty, Israel recognized Jordan's both special interests in the holy places. The holy places are very important to the Hashemite dynasty's legitimacy. They lost the holy places in Saudi Arabia when they were turfed out by King Saud in the 1920s. So having this holy place gives them an important religious connection. And Jordan views this special interest as including the entire religious fabric of Jerusalem. So, for example, a cable car built in East Jerusalem, they view as a status quo violation. And the proposed law to outlaw the call for prayer, they would say is a status quo violation. Israel would say, hey, that's not have nothing to do with the Temple Mount. That's our business, not yours. Now, I won't go through the various iterations of the status quo on Haram. After 1967, Moshe Dayan gave the keys back to the Waqf, saying, we don't need another Vatican here. And an informal arrangement developed. The Waqf sort of, we don't recognize you, but we'll meet you for tea 2 or 3 times a week and tell you what we're doing, and you'll tell us what we're doing, so we can informally come to an arrangement. This ended with the Intifada, the first Intifada. And since that time, and actually after the first Intifada, the Jewish entry onto the Ram was forbidden by the Waqf, and Israel forced the change after some years. So entry still is allowed. I should just say that the traditional view in Jewish law is that the Jews are not worthy of going up to the Haram. There are many ritual issues which preclude it according to Jewish law. So, in an interesting theological tension, the Temple Mount is the holiest place, but the Jews, according to Jewish law, traditionally conceived, can't go up onto it. Now, this changed with the Six-Day War in 1967, which many Israelis viewed as a miracle, the dawn of the redemption, and people felt that there should be a way, some people felt, to ascend the Temple Mount. One view was, we don't know exactly where on the Haram the Holy of Holies is, the most holy place, but we know where it isn't. So if you do your calculation and figure out where it isn't, you're allowed to go up there. You also have the growth of religio-nationalism. This is a whole shift in Israel from a socialist, secular state. And as I said, the miracle of the 67 victory led to a messianic view, although I have to say, and there's also a view that Zionism itself is a messianic view, but we'll put that aside, that the victory was evidence that we're entering the end times. And settling Eretz Yisrael Shalanu, the full land of Israel, and taking over the Temple Mount was seen as part of that project. Now, there are 2 different approaches here. One is a more modest one. The Messiah will come when Jews fulfill all the commandments, including the commandments you can only fulfill on the West Bank and on the Temple Mount. So here the focus is on fulfill the commandments, and the Messiah will come. Then there's a more activist messianic view. We are in the end times. Normal rules of morality do not necessarily apply. Violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, taking over the Temple Mount. Some years ago, there were groups planning to burn down the Dome of the Rock. This will bring the Messiah nearer. It is human agency that will move the end times along. And as we know, there is a fault line in theology of most religions related to when the Messiah will come. Will it come because of human agency, or will it come because God decides he wants to come? And then when it comes because of human agency, in Judaism, there's two views. The first view, which I said, if everyone fulfills the commandments. And then there's a second view, which is if things are awful, terrible, the Messiah will come to save the Jews, even if they haven't fulfilled the commandments. Thus, for example, Chief Rabbi Cook, the first Chief Rabbi of Israel, actually was positive to World War I, positive to the slaughter on the trenches. But he said this shows the world is in such bad shape that the Messiah will have to come. Besides religious nationalism, we have the growth of ethno-nationalism. And I'll just quote from two settler scholars on their view of why ethno-nationalism requires you to go up on the Temple Mount. Quote, there is one final consideration in making a consideration about entering Arbell. This is the issue of demonstrating Jewish control over this crucial area. If Jews do not show their bond to the area by regularly entering it and holding it to be at least as essential to their religion as the Muslims do to theirs, why should any Israeli or foreign negotiator value it as sacred and non-negotiable? Now, we have seen changes in the last few years related to the, quote, status quo, which I think is changing. First, the increased use of police. Originally, there was no police station on the Mount. Then there was a small one after there was some Muslim riot. Now the police are used more aggressively. The former minister of police, or the minister of police rather, reported to former minister Ben-Gvir, who just resigned over the ceasefire, and who believed that Jewish entrance on the Mount was not just legal, but positive. And I should add that the Temple Mount is one of the few places where Palestinians, especially youth, feel they can congregate freely. So in a certain sense, it is a site for Palestinian autonomy, which is one of the things that worry people like Ben-Gvir. Now, you can't talk about the changing status quo without talking about the increased Jewish entry onto the Mount and increased Jewish prayer, which used to be a no-no. Even Bibi Netanyahu said the Jews visit the Mount and pray at the Western Wall. But this is being slowly changed. First of all, the legal situation is quite interesting because the Israeli courts have said that you can't say Jews cannot pray anywhere in the land of Israel. It's a kind of fairness argument. But the police always say that prayer on the Mount is a threat to public order, and that prevents that right from being exercised. So you have to ask the question, how can you have a right and never be able to implement it? You can't do it at 2 a.m. on Thursday, at 4 a.m. on Sunday. What kind of right is it? So this is an unstable legal argument. It's unstable because there's a natural tension between saying it's a right and saying you can't exercise that right because of public order, and always saying that there's a public order problem. And while the courts have not moved from that at the high court level, some lower courts have found, hey, you haven't proved the public order. You can run up and visit. What we do know is the number of people going up to the Mount has increased significantly. Then we have the problem of prayer, which again was a real no-no. And if you were seen praying, of course you don't know what people do in their heart, but if you were seen visibly praying on the Mount, up till a few years ago, you would be escorted down, arrested, whatever. But in recent years, there's been a gradual change. The Jews not only ascend, but they pray, and they pray with a wink and a nod of the police, and sometimes with the acceptance of the police. Jewish communal prayer, with a minimum of at least 10 men, have become regular twice daily occurrences during the 4 hours in the morning and 1 in the early afternoon, 5 times a week. Those are the periods when Jews enter into the Mount. The chazan, the cantor, reads the blessings in a muted tone, and everyone, men and women, Haredim, religious Zionists, and secular, bound around him to hear and answer Amen. Most make sure not to sway, and if one of them does so, a police officer may gently advise him not to. But make no mistake, this is Jewish communal prayer on the Temple Mount. Sixth, I'll spend a moment on the Palestinian situation. The Palestinian religious situation, 6 October 7th, as with the Palestinian situation generally, has become more problematic. The Israeli trauma after October 7th has grown, and an increase in nationalism, both ethnic and religious, have resulted in increased marginalization and discrimination. As for the Haram, ministers, former ministers like Ben-Gvir and Benjamin Smotrich repeatedly have led and prayed on the Temple Mount. And Ben-Gvir has said that Israeli policy is to allow prayers. Bibi has said no, but this is less the case. And as I said before, Ben-Gvir is right in practice. And this is a big problem for the WAP. And I'm sorry to say that the increase in visitors and increase in prayer is not likely to be easily turned back. Why? Because in 1967, a few hundred people went onto the Mount. Last year, 50-odd thousand went onto the Mount. And as the religious prohibition against Jews going up to the Mount diminishes, and I don't say that cheerfully, there is increasing fear by the Palestinians of Judaization of the Haram. And the Palestinians have precedent for their fear. What has happened at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, where there have been separate entrances, where there have been separate times for prayer, where there has been significant control of that holy site, and the control has been bluntly not favoring the Palestinians. Separate days and separate times. So the sad fact is that if there's no mutual good faith effort to regulate these visits over time, and the WAP officially would reject this, the Muslims will ultimately be crowded out of the Haram, and the consequences will be highly unfortunate. For the Christians, October 7th made clear that the Jew, as Ben-Gvir has said, we Jews are owners here. You're here by suffering. The notion that the city would be multicultural in some way, multi-religious in some way, is rapidly vanishing. Attacks on Christian cemeteries and churches increased, including a March attack on the Church of 23 attacks on the Church of Gethsemane in East Jerusalem, and numerous others. The perennial problem of personal abuse of Christian clerics increased. The Religious Freedom Data Center and Hotline report that while such incidents spiked before October 7th, they reduced afterwards because of reduced visitor flow, but now they're once again on the rise. And in February of last year, the abbot of the Domitian Abbey was spat upon and cursed when walking past the Zion Gate. This is a particular problem for the Armenians because the Armenian quarter is on the way to, at least the official way of walking towards the Western Wall. And therefore, there's a lot of abuse, including spitting by young religious Jews, yeshiva students, on Armenians. The Christians are also concerned about land sales, which they view as fraudulent, where church property is sold to developers. And as I said before, they're concerned with taxes, particularly the arnona, the municipal taxes, and water bills and electricity, where they claimed exemption under the Ottoman status quo. Various pre-state arrangements with the French, and in the case of the Roman Catholics, the Vatican-Israel Fundamental Agreement. Now, this fundamental agreement causes a special problem for Catholics. When it was signed, Israel got what it wanted most up front, recognition. And then they were supposed to negotiate a number of sub-agreements, including one on finance. That means tax. And it's been over 20 years, almost 30 years, and they haven't done it. A cynic could say that Israel got what it wanted and didn't really intend to go further with the fundamental agreement. I leave that to others. Now, the last point I want to touch on is the most complex and maybe the most difficult, the sharing of Holy Spirit. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the problem is intra-religious, the sharing between the different denominations that have been given rights in the church and given sub-rights in the church. And historically, this is very fractious, a riot. The Ottomans used to be called in to settle mass fistfights, and the British. Recently, however, and remarkably, the churches have one person meet in the evening together from each church, and they talk out problems. And this is, of course, a reduction in this intramural, intra-religious situation. This is not necessarily true with other situations in the Holy Land. Although before 1948, we have visitors' logbooks showing Muslims and Christians praying at the tomb of Rachel, which now, I'm sorry to say, looks like a fort. We had sharing at the tomb of Elijah near Haifa. There have been some recent problems, but historically they were sharing. And before the 2000s, the tomb of Samuel in the West Bank was also shared. And interestingly, Jews prayed in the basement and Muslims on the first floor. That has changed in recent years. But the problems of sharing in other places are much greater, most spectacularly in Hebron, the Cave of the Patriarch, which I discussed earlier, and the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. The question is whether my presence on a sacred space of another defiles that sacred space. If it does, then it's likely the case that holy places are incommensurable. It's a zero-sum game. But if not, then the problem with sharing is not theology, but politics and popular religion. Now, this is a severely understudied subject. It deserves far more attention than it has. And I would hope that the various religions would get together and collect sermons, edicts, pontifical statements, rabbinical statements, which suggest that there may be some opportunity for sharing, that it's not incommensurable. Part of the problem is popular religion. Let me end with the tale of the Christian Israeli Army war veteran, David Boskanovsky, was killed in Gaza in 2013. He was buried in a military cemetery, not a religious cemetery, a military cemetery, whereby a recent Israeli law said that all faiths who are soldiers can be buried. However, his family were ordered to remove the cross that they placed on the gravestone. It was said that this violated the sanctity of the cemetery. Now, to my knowledge, there is no Jewish law which says that. If you go to a military cemetery of the British in Gaza, of Americans in France, you have all different religious insignia. In fact, in the United States military cemeteries, there are over 35 approved religious insignia, including Wiccans. However, popular religion saw that, and religio nationalism saw this as a violation of sanctity. And this is the problem we face when we're dealing with sharing of holy places. I will stop now, and I'm eager to hear the comments and criticism.
All right. Thank you very much, Marshall. And we'll turn to the panel now, where our first respondent is Father David Neuhaus. He's originally from South Africa, but has lived most of his life in Israel, has been a Jesuit since 1992, a priest since 2000. He works, as I mentioned, at the, in fact, he heads the Jesuit community at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem, and he has published widely in various topics, including most prominently biblical studies. He has publications in English, French, Arabic, Hebrew, Italian. We look forward to his comments in response to Marshall. David?
Thank you very much. A little correction. I am not the superior of the Jesuit community. I was once upon a time. And a little correction to Marshall that David Bogdanovsky, whose family was told to remove the cross, died last year in December, not in 2013, but in 2023.
Yes, correct.
Okay. I would like to respond very briefly to the book, which I found an excellent tool to understand the issues that are very complex and that Marshall tried to explain orally. It is analytical, informative, very readable, but also a critical commentary on what is going on, which was apparent from the way that Marshall spoke even tonight. So the great complexity is presented extremely well, distinguishing the different levels. And again, we're speaking about Jerusalem and the holy sites in Jerusalem. The different levels being, of course, the city as a city, its inhabitants. And of course, that means when we're talking religiously, it's Jewish Muslim and Christian inhabitants. And then, of course, the complexity of the different places themselves, with the focus, of course, as was clear from Marshall's talk, being on the Haram al-Sharif and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then more marginally with other religious sites around Jerusalem and even in the rest of the territory of the Holy Land. Now, one of the issues of complexity that is pretty well handled in the book is the intersection that was apparent from Marshall's own presentation between what is religious and what is ethnic, nationalist, and ideological. And here I think that the book is very careful. I think that Marshall was a little less careful in the way that he spoke tonight. For example, the whole big problem of an Israeli presence at all in East Jerusalem, which is not Israeli according to international law. So, of course, that brings up a whole series of mega problems, aside from the more micro problems of how the Israeli police interacts with the Waqf. The religious issues versus the national ones are extremely important to try and understand what's going on in the 20th and 21st century, because a holy place is almost by definition also a place of national ethnic importance. And a lot of the friction that took place all through the 20th century and continues into the 21st is not necessarily problems between Jews and Muslims in as far as they are religious communities, but between Israelis and Palestinians in as far as they are conducting a war on a national ethnic basis. Of course, religion is, of course, manipulated and mobilized within this war. So, of course, as Marshall showed very well in his talk, and is showed in an excellent way in the book, the holy place is not some kind of static reality, but an evolving reality that changes with regard to its significance and the reasons for its significance. The book deals very, very well with the historical nature of the question. Sometimes, Marshall, a little side comment, perhaps not a sufficient distinction between what is historical and what is mythological. I refer here to a comment that made me smile on page 105 with regard to archaeological evidence for the baptism of Christ at the Makhtas. Even a Christian, I don't think, would go searching for archaeological evidence of a biblical event like the baptism. So now I'd like, after saying this is excellent, analytical, informative, readable, and critical, to make a few passing critical comments. On page 171, there's a very interesting reference to a seminal work by Menachem Klein from the University of Bar Ilan on life in Palestine, Mandate Palestine before 1936. And there you talked in the book about a sharing of holy places. Now, it's very interesting that in the words that you addressed to us tonight, you devoted a lot more attention to this very fascinating history of sharing holy places, but it's very marginal in the book, and I would have liked a lot more discussion of the possibilities from the past that can be projected into a conception of the future that looks a little different from the present. Okay, a very interesting formula, sharing holy places, that calls, I think, in the book for a lengthier discussion. Now, 3, also marginal but critical comments. One of them you related to right at the beginning of your talk, so I imagine you've received a little bit of criticism about this as well. You said, for the sake of economy, you're going to call the place the Temple Mount. I don't like that economy. I think it's worthy of the problematic, thorny nature of the question to all through the book refer to it, at least by a double name, Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, not alternating as you sometimes do, but mostly referring to it as the Temple Mount. Once again, I think here very important to distinguish between history and mythology so that we don't get wrapped up in internal talk that has very little sense when you're talking about scientific or rational discourse. Another point that left me a little perplexed, I found that the discussion of UNESCO was particularly biased, whereas I called the book analytical, informative, readable, and critical. I think when it comes to UNESCO, the authors of this book, have adopted a very Israeli perspective. And I think that that is very clear when you end your discussion of UNESCO with the words of Danny Danon, not exactly a neutral commentator on what's going on. And I wonder why it is outrageous to suggest that Rachel's tomb is within the borders of Palestine. I didn't understand why that was such an outrageous claim. And finally, the last critical point that I'll make, you, in the book on page 114, express concern, and this is regularly expressed by Israelis and by people in the Western world that are very, very concerned about proper treatment of Christians in the Palestinian Authority. I didn't find, although I did in your words tonight, but didn't find in the book too much concern for Christians and their rights within the state of Israel. Of course, Christians as a religious minority, both in Palestine and in Israel, and when I say Palestine, I mean, of course, what Israelis referred to as the territories occupied in 1967 in Judea and Samaria, if you like, according to Israeli usage, I didn't find a parallel there, which I think is very important, particularly from a Christian point of view. And finally, one word. I hope that this book is read. I think it's a very, very useful commentary on a very complex subject. And if it needs a second edition, there are some mistakes that I would suggest you write to me, and I'll give you a list of them. Confusions between Gush Emunim and Gush Etzion, the use of Umrah for Jerusalem. There is no such thing, as far as I know, as an Umrah to Jerusalem. There is a confusion sometimes between Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic, and some names that are not spelt correctly. I'd be very, very happy to contribute to a second edition that would get rid of some of those errors. But finally, in conclusion, congratulations. The book is, I think, an excellent contribution to this very complex study of the holy sites and how they are administered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those pointed but appreciative comments. We turn now to Moussa Abu Ramadan, who, as I mentioned, is professor of Muslim law and Islamology at the University of Strasbourg in France. His specialties include Muslim law, Muslim legal theory, and logic, and particular topics such as Muslim family law, international Muslim law, contract law, Muslim legal theory, and Arabic logic. And among the topics that he's written on are ritual prayer, interreligious marriage, the theory of war, circumcision law, and child support in Islamic law. Professor Abu Ramadan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you all. I'm happy also to see my friend, also David, long time ago. Also, I use, before being interested in Islamic law 20 years ago, I made few articles also on public international law, and I am happy that my article on Mytilene was cited in the book. I think it is the only quotation of this article, but it was many years ago before I was interested in Islamic law. So I joined my friend David for concerning telling that it is important book. It is most comprehensive book, original book on the subject. It is very rich in documentation, analysis, very clear. The arguments are very clear. We understand there is no a lot of the subject is complex, but also this is maybe it is a lot of pedagogical. We can understand easily, although it is very complicated, but it is presented very easily. The book contains analysis of the development of the status of holy sites, not just from the point of view of legal, but also the politics and many important details, cases where there were struggles, especially in different religious Christian communities. So there is a lot of historical event. Study also with history of the issues, starting by the capitulation, say we will not start before, and then go through the mandate period, and then Jordanian and Israeli, and until today, or the last 2 years, before the last 2 years. So it is very important study, give a comprehensive view on the issue. The study is mainly public in public international law, and also there are also Israeli law. So the book tries, there is a big effort to be balanced, criticize many times the position of Israel, not as I wanted, but better than nothing. There are many places which I will write it differently. Some examples were mentioned by my friend David, but I will also mention other examples concerning the critics of the State of Israel. For example, we say the interpretation of the haram. We say haram, it is just the shrines, Mosque Omar Mosque and the Dam Rock, or it is all the place. And you say according to new reading, without saying who are the new reading, without footnotes, although we have thousands of footnotes, but you make interpretation of the haram with a very strict interpretation. It means that the Jordanian have less power than the Israeli. So this is, I think, problematic. This is more the Israeli point of view. Another issue, it is not clear for me. Do you say that also Jewish has right to visit and to pray in Al-Aqsa? Or it is not clear. I think this is where you are going to this. Maybe if you want to make equality or right to pray, so also maybe Christian and Muslim could pray on the Temple Mount. Okay, so it will be real equality in this case. Another issue, you mentioned different time in different book the symmetry of Ma'manillah. I think this issue tell us a lot about how Israel is dealing with the holy site of Muslim. The problem of Ma'manillah, it is a symmetry in Jerusalem, and the municipality, ironically, wanted to construct a museum of tolerance on the symmetry of Muslim. And the architect said it is not possible to deviate from his plan. So the beauty of the architect was considered by the architect and by the Supreme Court like absolute value, and the religion was perceived as relative. So I think it could be more development would be more interesting, and also maybe balanced the authority of Israeli state, which are many times you say it less respective. You say that in many cases when they go to the court, you say it in your book that the Muslim don't succeed. I'm not saying the majority. I think in all the cases, always they lose. So on the legal point of view, beside you mentioned the capitulation, mandate documents. So the book also you make analysis of bilateral treaties. So this is very important and fascinating between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Holy See, and Israel and France. There is just some, I think, a mistake, because you say Yuval Fisher, it was before the creation of the State of Israel. The State of Israel was created in 48, and the Yuval Fisher 49. So the Yuval Fisher is after the creation of the State of Israel, because it was in your book. I think there is few mistakes, as said David. I think so. So you said that there is different bilateral. So Israel and Jordan, Israel and Holy See, bilateral agreement, I mean, Israel and France. But there is no effort to see how the articulation of these different successive treaties dealing with the same object. It is a classical question of public international law of treaties. When you have different states dealing with different issue, not different issue, as the same object. So what's happened? So because all these treaties that we mention speak about the holy places. So how is the articulation between the different treaties? So you don't deal with this question a lot. You will just make analysis separately of the different bilateral agreement. On the multilateral level, multilateral treaty, so we speak also with UNESCO and not always with the right interpretation. You give more Israel interpretation, but this was mentioned also by David. But you mentioned also the question between also this question of holy site also with the level of freedom of religion, which is important. And you mentioned there is a great analysis of Article 18 of the International Covenant of Political and Civil Rights. I think what it is missing in your analysis is what we call the local custom. So besides the treaties, whether bilateral, multilateral, which you examine a lot, there is a customary rules. You mentioned at the end, but you mentioned universal custom, but I mean the rule concerning, for example, bilateral custom, local custom, it means when a custom could be between two states. For example, it could be very helpful when you, in your book, you check, you speak and you analyze the exemption of taxes. And there is Arnona, municipal taxes, Arnona, and there is a lot of problem you mentioned in your book. But there is, for example, a ruling of Supreme Court, which is of Kassodia. It was given in the 80s. And the Israeli Supreme Court reject this argument that there is a custom and saying that there is no general practice on this. They are right. There is no general practice of exemption on taxation or local taxation, but the court ignored that beside universal customs, there are regional and local customs. It could be, the custom could be not just between all the state or universal custom. It could be between two states, or it could be a region, for example, Europe or the Arab world or Maghreb. So custom could be between two states. This could resolve the problem of Arnuna. Okay, so this is, I give you just idea, because when a practice is done between two states, in two states, I mean, for example, Ottoman Empire and France, and they continue for many decades. So this practice between two states make local custom. Another issue, there is no enough analysis of Jerusalem as occupied territories from the point of view of international law. You mentioned it. You mentioned, they say, some people say, or some, it is not some people say, it is all people say, except few scientists say that it is not occupied. You mentioned, for example, the advisory opinion of 2004. So it is very important. All the international community, even the United States, you mentioned it, say that it is occupied territory, even if they recognize, they put their embassy in Jerusalem, they didn't change their position. There are a lot of United Nations resolution, institution, state practice, ICJ, legal opinion. You mentioned the 2004, but there is one last year, but you didn't have, because your book finished 2 years ago. But all of them say Israel is occupied territory. So I think this could add on the analysis another dimension. Okay, but all this technical remark that does not reduce your excellent effort and comprehensive and excellent analysis of this book. And I enjoyed to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Moussa. All right, so we have comments lastly from Dan Arbell. He is a Middle East and Israel expert based here in DC. He has a position at the International Institute for Strategic Studies here and is also a scholar in residence at the School for International Service and the Center for Israel Studies at American University. He specializes in Israeli politics and foreign policy, and also works on the roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict in a distinguished foreign service career for Israel. He served in senior posts, including in the US and in Japan, and has also worked a good deal at the Home Office in Jerusalem. Dan, we look forward to hearing your take on the book.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you all. It's a pleasure being here, and I'll try and be brief because we are eager to hear Marshall's rebuttal. And so, what I want to say, as David and as Moussa have stated, I've read the book with great interest. It's a fascinating account. It has rich historical foundations, and I think that it's an important contribution to the academic discourse. But I believe those dealing with Jerusalem, present and hopefully in the future, will be able to use it as a reference point, as a way to move forward in discussions as to what Marshall alluded to, is also finding a shared space, shared arrangements or ways to have everybody work together or live together in Jerusalem and be able to practice their own religion there. I do want to focus my points on the politics of it, as that's my areas of expertise, and I do want to, Marshall covered it very extensively, so I don't want to repeat what he said, but I do want to point to the fact that the arrangement reached by Moshe Dayan in 1967, what's known as the status quo, or the more modern status quo over the holy sites, with the Waqf in charge of administering the Muslim holy sites, with Israel in charge of the enveloping areas and security, directing most of Jewish worshippers to the Western Wall. At that arrangement, while many changes have occurred, formally still exists. There has been erosion in that arrangement, in the status quo, over the past few decades. But I think that if Marshall spoke about the last 2 years, I think it started actually back in 2015, and it's due to a combination of circumstances. First of all, it's as a response to developments in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in the aftermath of Oslo, of Camp David II, of negotiations that on final status issues, which included Jerusalem among the parties, and with U.S. involvement. And I think that in that regard, for Israeli Jews, then this issue became more kind of they began viewing this issue more in from the perspective, from the lens of the peace process, or the dynamics of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But while there was this process of in reaction or response to developments concerning the conflict, then there was also among national religious Jews inside Israel, there was a growing sense that the time has come not only to praying at the Western Wall and seeing the Western Wall as the point of worship, the main site of worship, was received over the years, but kind of moving from the Western Wall to what's the real thing, which is the Holy of Holies, which is Temple Mount. And we've seen, so while politically we've seen a process of this becoming an issue, then also religiously, we see among national religious leaders of the national religious sector in Israel, rabbis and other spiritual leaders, and that translated into a growing number of visitors. And Marshall mentioned in 2024, 51,000 visited compared to just 10 years ago, where you had around 9,000, 10,000, 12,000. And this is very dramatic in the sense that both has to do with activism on the ground of organizations around Temple Mount that have encouraged more Jews to go up, ascend Temple Mount, pray there, and conduct other activities in permitted areas, so-called. And at the same time, also having police, as Marshall said, Israeli police, being more, how should I say, lax in how they approach this issue, or kind of looking the other way in many cases that we've seen. And I think that this has come to the peak. What we're seeing right now is the fact that among those, if in the past those supporting ascending Temple Mount and praying there were on the margins, on the fringes, then today, beginning 2 years ago in December 2022, when Itamar Ben-Gvir became a minister of national security inside the government and in charge of Israeli police, which is kind of enforcing the laws there on Temple Mount, that has actually added, so to speak, fuel to the fire and made this a much more contested issue, with Ben-Gvir calling for Jewish sovereignty or Jewish ownership of Temple Mount, with his party, Jewish Power, Otzma Yehudit, advocating for that. And you see more and more in that camp kind of supporting that. I think, but if you look overall at the Israeli public, then I would just want to quote, before I end, this poll that was conducted just in May 2022, the Van Leer Institute, which found that in the general Jewish public in Israel, only 36% believe or see the importance of having Israeli sovereignty over Temple Mount, while 63% look at different other arrangements like a shared custody, an international regime, and so on and so forth, and do not necessarily find Israeli ownership or sovereignty over Temple Mount critical. And so I want to place that while among nationalist religious Jews, this has been increasing, then in the general public, not so much. And interestingly, very much among the ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, this is an issue which still a lot of Haredi Jews still very much oppose the whole concept of ascendance to Temple Mount and prayer there. And spiritual leaders of the Haredi community are still very much against it, and that's what they're directing their followers. And it's interesting to see that nowadays inside the Netanyahu coalition, we have the ultra-nationalist parties that are supporting greater presence and in Temple Mount, yet versus in the same coalition, the ultra-Orthodox, which are very much mostly against it. And I think that the hope, I'd say, for the future of this not becoming a greater problem that will lead to conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians and the Arab world and the international community, is the fact that Haredis are still very much in opposition to it. They're kind of holding the fort, so to speak, in making this not making this issue become even bigger. I'd stop here, and I just want to again thank Marshall for the book, which was fascinating, and thank you for having me in this discussion. I'd end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just a quick reminder to anyone in the audience who would like to register a question with the panel, you can use the Q&A feature. Marshall, you've heard some comments and criticisms of your book and presentation. How do you respond?
Well, I thank everybody for their comments, and particularly the reference to mistakes, which are, of course, all mine. I'm just going to make a few comments. The first is about UNESCO. Look, you have to understand that UNESCO is soft law. It is not hard public international law. Now, I completely appreciate that if you are weak, if you're the weaker side, you trot out the law. because that's all you have. And if you are strong, you want to minimize the law because you have extra legal power. So at least where I would differ in terms of whether I'm one way or the other too much is that at least from my perspective, the UNESCO regulations are soft law, and therefore you have to treat them. One would likely treat them as that. Although I appreciate that they're a strong part of the Palestinian armorarium, so to speak, because they don't have that much help from you. I do think that Israel has tried to weaponize UNESCO in some respect. And I tried to point out in the book, perhaps not sufficiently, that the effort to create the Jewish Heritage Commission and have Jewish heritage protection in areas in the West Bank really almost create conflict, and that the Israelis don't appreciate that in Islam, the Jewish prophets are also Muslim prophets. So it's not kind of simply aggression to try to have places for Muslim prayer at sites of Jewish prophets, for example. Now, on the question of the Museum of Tolerance, so I have to, this is the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Museum of Tolerance, and the cemeteries in general. I hoped, and apparently not sufficiently, have suggested in the book that situation is scandalous, that the idea of building a Museum of Tolerance on bones in a cemetery is almost risible. I personally pointed out to the head of Simon Wiesenthal Center that 40 years from now, he'll be known for the building on human bones rather than a place of tolerance, and he should ask the Israeli government for money to move, but of course, they weren't going to do so. In particular, it's quite interesting that the views of the Islamic religious officials were ignored in terms of their view of what makes a sanctity at a cemetery. And quite almost humorously, when Teddy Kollek, before the building of the Museum of Tolerance, wanted to build an Independence Park on the cemetery, he couldn't get a ruling from a local Islamic authority. So he got a ruling from an Islamic authority in Haifa, who the next year they put in jail for corruption. The Israelis put in jail for corruption. So that's a very unfortunate situation in terms of cemeteries, and in fact the treatment of Muslim cemeteries, as well as Muslim holy places in Israel, is worth a lot more study. Now, the question of my personal view on the right to visit and to pray. So this is, I've tried not to permeate the book with my personal perspective, but I suppose it's impossible. In the perfect world, there should be a way for everyone to pray. We don't live in a perfect world. We live in a historical world. And in the historical world, we have a modus vivendi where the Jews go to the Temple Mount, to the Western Wall to pray, and not to the Haram Temple Mount. And I think unless there is a broader political settlement, which would lead to a more nuanced theological understanding I think it should stay that way. I do point out again the importance of studying, which I'm not competent to do, but many of you are, of having a group that studies the opinion as to whether it is forbidden or defiling to have the other enter your holy space, because if it is not, if this is a political issue, not which is a theological issue being used in a political way, then there's a lot of other possibilities for compromise resolution. I also believe, and this is actually quite controversial, what I say in the book, that you can't put the genie back in the bottle, and that rather than refusing to discuss this problem with the Israel authorities, if the Waqf doesn't, they will over time be overwhelmed by Jewish prayer. And that's the one thing you don't want, because there's a lot of ways to regulate that prayer. I'll just make it up. 200 people a day, not when they're actual Muslim prayer. So there needs to be a kind of management, joint management, rather than simply everyone going to their perhaps correct but extreme position. Now, bilateral treaties, you make a good point. I didn't do that. I think I should have. I should have called you, Moussa, for advice on how to do it. I do think it's worth understanding that the Israelis have had a very narrow view of these treaties. The French treaty agreement, for many years it was considered secret by Israel, and the Israelis said, well, it's with the Jewish agency, not with us, so it doesn't count. However, in practice, it's quite interesting. The Israelis did accept the treaty. So just as one humorous example, the treaty called for customs exemption for wagons, which we now would translate as cars, and the finance ministry would hand down the customs, the tariff, and rather than get into a fight with the French over whether it should be paid or not, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would pay the tariff to the finance ministry, so that everyone could maintain their own view of that statute. The Jordanian, the question of their special interest, again, as I said, the Jordanians take an expansive view regarding to the religious fabric. The Vatican situation is quite interesting. As I said, this is the one recent case where Israel accepted the status quo. They did not accept the status quo in '67. However, we don't know what that means in terms of the Vatican Israel Fundamental Accord, largely because Israel has really dropped the ball on implementing the accord, both in terms of the treaty, the sub-treaties. One of the ones they did sign, I had something to do with that. And the second one, the finance one, is just left up in the air. So we really don't know if that treaty, well, it's a formal treaty. By the way, Israel has never brought it before the Knesset. So it's, and under the analog of treaties, you're supposed to, in good faith, move treaties forward to the Knesset. That's one of the reasons that George W. Bush withdrew from the ICC, because while we had signed it, they didn't want to go forward with it. So they said, we better get out of it. The question of local customs, again, is a good point. And I do think we need more knowledge about local custom. We need an anthropology of interaction on the holy places. I gave one example. In 1967, when the WAP refused, said we don't deal with Israel because we are in charge here. There was a practice of informal meetings over coffee to make sure everyone was aware of what everyone else is doing. This, of course, can only happen if there's a belief of good faith. I thank everyone for their criticism, and you can just tell Cambridge University Press that you want a second edition. Thanks.
Thanks again, Marshall. We are almost at the end of our time. We have just a few minutes left. I thought I would just go around one more time to the panelists and ask you, just in a minute or so, what hopes or fears you have regarding how the incoming Trump administration and other current developments are likely to change this very complex problem that you've been discussing of contesting holy sites in Jerusalem. David, do you have any thoughts?
Well, my thoughts and my faith are in total conflict, because my thoughts listen to the words of some of the people appointed by Donald Trump, the new representative, the US representative to the United Nations, the new US ambassador to Israel. And it is chilling to hear them say, without any hesitation or embarrassment, that they actually think like the most extremist elements in the Israeli administration. It is terrifying. And of course, Marshall and Dan have both spoken about the discourse being kidnapped by these people. And now to hear Trump appointees say we're with them means that we're heading towards, I don't know what. I really have no idea. It conflicts with my faith because I believe in miracles. I believe that Donald Trump might not be led by the nose by people that he's appointed. I can only hope and pray that there is room for the Almighty to intervene, because if not, blood will spill more and more and more, and we've already seen enough of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Moussa.
We cannot know what Trump will do, because nobody will know what Trump is doing. I don't know if Trump himself know what he want to do, but I think the situation cannot be worse. You know, there is one phrase which called in Arabic. I don't know how David will translate it. أكثر من الأرض الله ما سخط. I don't know how to translate it. How you translate it? Okay, so it means that the things are already very worse, so you cannot go down. This is one thing. The other thing is you know about now Trump is telling a relation with Saudi Arabia, 600 billion of investment and all this stuff. I think this will make him calm concerning the racist and aggressive sentiment in Jerusalem. So I don't know what he will do, but I think it cannot be worse than it is now, and maybe it could be even better concerning his relation with Saudi Arabia and want to make a process of peace, not peace. Maybe we will see.
All right. Perhaps grounds for some optimism. Dan?
I actually think it could get worse, but I do believe that it's the jury's still out on Trump's presidency, and I think that just like on the ceasefire deal, which counterintuitively maybe we will see in a few years, some ability to return to some process between Israelis and Palestinians. Of course, now is not, it's not going to happen now, and of course not with this current Israeli government. But those voices that David has mentioned inside the administration in different positions are just part of a group of people that not all of them necessarily are on the same page when it comes to, and again, a lot has been said about Trump being transactional and unpredictable. And so I'd like to, again, while I'm not very optimistic, I would like to hope together with, as David has said, to pray for an opportunity to actually get back to the negotiations and find and dialogue and find common ground on different issues, among them Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. A last word, Marshall, before we close?
Well, I'll just thank everyone for that comment. I've learned a lot. As to the future, I again subscribe to David's view that we need faith, because logic tells us we're going into a deep abyss. I think the president relies a lot on his advisors, which are not at this point a positive sign, but he also has a great desire to make a deal with Saudi Arabia, and a lot will depend on how much the Saudis are firm in their view related to a Palestinian state. I should point out that the Abraham Accord, while they did not speak too much to the holy places, did say there should be sort of, quote, equal opportunity for prayer, but it didn't really pursue that. I'm not sure if that was pretty much lifted out of some right-wing Israeli talking points. I think if we have hope for the future on this, other than a change in Israel, which I defer to Dan on, it's both the Saudis and the desire of the president, his transactional view, to leave a legacy that will get him historical acclaim. But as to the holy places, I think we're in for a very period of turmoil and frustration, and I hate to say it, violence and sadness. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry to end on that note, but we value all of your expertise, and thank you again for participating in this panel today. Marshall, I hope that the book finds a wide readership, because it does shed light on one of the trickiest issues of our day. I thank the audience as well, and we'll hope to see you again at another one of our events. Take care.
Thank you.